when bronze changed the world. Before iron became the ordinary metal of swords and plows, before alphabetic writing spread across the shores of the Mediterranean, and before the classical cities of Greece began to tell stories about heroes from a vanished age, there was another world. It was older, slower, and more fragile than the world that came after it. It was a world of palace courtyards, clay tablets, cedar beams, painted ships, desert roads, and bronze tools brightened by firelight. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, Crete, and mainland Greece, rulers and scribes built societies that depended on careful records, distant trade, and the controlled movement of food, metal, labor, and messages. Bronze gave this world part of its name, but bronze was never only a metal. It was a relationship between places. Copper might come from one mountain or island, tin from another land much farther away, and charcoal from forests that had to be cut, hauled, and burned. To make bronze was to connect miners, smelters, sailors, merchants, guards, accountants, and rulers. A finished bronze blade or chisel carried inside it a hidden map of roads, ports, and agreements. In that sense, the Bronze Age was not merely an age of objects. It was an age of networks. The metal itself was an alloy, most often made by combining copper with a smaller amount of tin. Copper was easier to find around the eastern Mediterranean, especially on Cyprus, whose very landscape became tied to the metal trade. Tin was rarer and more mysterious. It had to travel from farther sources, sometimes through many hands before reaching the workshops of kings and cities. Once combined, the two metals made a material harder and more useful than copper alone. Bronze could become axes, spearheads, swords, razors, mirrors, bowls, cauldrons, pins, hinges, scale weights, and sacred figurines. It helped farmers, soldiers, builders, priests, and craftsmen, but it also made people more dependent on the roots that supplied it. Long before the final collapse, Bronze Age societies had learned to organize life at a scale that earlier villages could not have managed. In Mesopotamia, cities rose along rivers that flooded and shifted through flat plains. In Egypt, the Nile carried grain, stone, people, and royal power through a long green corridor surrounded by desert. In Anatolia, the Hittite kings ruled from highland centers and reached southward toward Syria. On Crete, palaces such as Knossos had once anchored a maritime culture of storerooms, frescoes, and ritual spaces. On mainland Greece, Mycenaean lords built fortified citadels at places like Mycenae, Turin, and Pylos. Along the Levantan coast, port cities faced both inland caravans and the open sea. Writing made this world more durable and more complicated. In Mesopotamia and Syria, scribes pressed wedge-shaped cuneiform signs into wet clay. In Egypt, officials used hieroglyphic and hieratic writing on stone, pottery, and papyrus. In the Mycenaean world, scribes wrote linear B on clay tablets, recording goods, workers, livestock, offerings, and military equipment. These records were not usually literature. They were lists, accounts, orders, and inventories. Yet they reveal a world intensely concerned with counting. Sheep, jars of oil, bronze vessels, wheels, chariot parts, textiles, grain, and laborers all passed through the hands of administrators. The palace stood at the center of many late Bronze Age societies. It was not just a royal house. It was a storehouse, workshop, archive, temple partner, military center, and redistributive machine. Goods moved into the palace from farms, herds, mines, and workshops. Some were stored, some were redistributed, some were sent as gifts, some were used to feed workers or support specialists. The palace could sponsor craftsmen who made fine objects, scribes who kept records, messengers who carried orders, and soldiers who defended roads and borders. A ruler's power depended not only on armies, but on the ability to make the harvest, the workshop, and the port speak the same administrative language. This system created impressive stability, but it also created dependence. A village could survive many disruptions if it mostly fed itself. A palace economy required predictable flows. Grain had to arrive. Copper and tin had to be available. Ships had to sail. Roads had to remain open. Scribes had to know what was owed and what had been delivered. Workers had to receive rations. Diplomatic relationships had to be maintained. If one part of the system failed, the damage could move outward, like a crack crossing fired clay. At its height, the Bronze Age world was not isolated into separate kingdoms staring across empty space. It was full of messages. Kings called one another brother when they considered themselves equals. They exchanged gifts, brides, craftsmen, doctors, statues, horses, precious stones, gold, silver, and complaints. A ruler might ask why the gold sent from Egypt was less than expected, or why messengers had been delayed, or why a promised marriage alliance had not yet been completed. These letters show the dignity of royal courts, but also their anxiety. Friendship between kings was formal, valuable, and constantly negotiated. Beyond the palaces, ordinary people made the world work in ways that are harder to see. Farmers sowed grain, tended vines and olives, repaired walls, raised animals, and endured tax demands. Sailors watched winds and stars, trusting wooden hulls over waters that could turn violent without warning. Potters shaped storage jars and decorated vessels. Smiths fed furnaces and hammered metal. Weavers produced textiles that could be wealth, tribute, clothing, and trade goods all at once. Carpenters cut beams for roofs and ships. Shepherds moved flocks across seasonal landscapes. Their names are often lost, but the Bronze Age rested on their labor. The world they built was beautiful and vulnerable. A painted palace wall, a bronze sword, a cargo ship, a clay tablet, and a royal letter all belonged to the same pattern of complexity. Each object implied many others. Each depended on skills and supplies gathered from beyond one household or one town. The Bronze Age was powerful because it connected distant places. It was vulnerable for the same reason. When the connections held, kings could build, fight, feast, and correspond across hundreds of miles. When the connections broke, the palace world would discover how much of its strength had always depended on movement. For centuries, that movement seemed almost natural. Ships crossed between Cyprus, the Levant, Egypt, and the Aegean. Donkeys and carts moved goods inland. Caravans carried metal, textiles, stone, timber, and luxury goods through corridors of trade and diplomacy. The great kingdoms watched one another, competed with one another, married into one another, and sometimes described themselves as members of a shared international order. Yet no order is permanent simply because it has lasted a long time. By the late 13th century before the Common Era, the Bronze Age world had become deeply interconnected. It had also become exposed to every shock that could travel through those connections. The story of its collapse is not the story of one fire, one invasion, or one mistake. It is the story of a system that had grown elaborate enough to produce magnificent cities and fragile enough to fail in many places at once. To understand the fall, we first have to understand the palace world at its height. When scribes still counted jars of oil, kings still sent letters across the sea, and bronze still moved through the hands of people who believed their world would continue. Palaces, kings, and scribes. The palace world of the late Bronze Age was built from stone walls, timber roofs, sealed storerooms, guarded gates, and rooms where scribes sat with clay, reed, ink, and memory. To walk into one of these centers in imagination is to enter a place where power had become architectural. Courtyards gathered people into ordered spaces. Storerooms held jars of oil, wine, grain, and perfumes. Workshops turned raw materials into finished goods. Archives preserved the temporary memory of a year's obligations. The palace was where royal command became daily procedure. In Egypt, royal power had already worn many shapes by the late Bronze Age. The pharaoh was not only a king in the ordinary sense, but a sacred figure whose authority linked the human realm with cosmic order. Temples, tombs, quarries, armies, scribes, and estates formed a vast administrative world along the Nile. Egypt's wealth came from agriculture supported by the river's flood, from gold in Nubia, from tribute, from military campaigns, and from the skilled organization of labor. Its monuments were made of stone, but its government also depended on perishable materials: papyrus, rope, wood, baskets, grain, and the human habit of obedience. North of Egypt, the Levant was a corridor of cities and ports, squeezed between sea, desert, and empire. Places such as Ugarit became especially important because they stood where inland routes and maritime routes could meet. A coastal city could receive ships from Cyprus or the Aegean, while also sending goods inland towards Syria and Mesopotamia. Such cities were not always independent in the modern sense. They could fall under the influence of larger powers, pay tribute, host envoys, and negotiate survival between stronger neighbors. Their importance came from position. Whoever controlled the port controlled the meeting place of many worlds. In Anatolia, the Hittite kingdom rose into one of the great powers of the age. From its capital at Hattusa, set in a rugged landscape of high ground and massive walls, Hittite rulers managed a kingdom of treaties, vassals, armies, and archives. Their world was not a simple empire radiating uniform control in all directions. It was a political structure of negotiated loyalty, military obligation, dynastic tension, and frontier pressure. Hittite kings wrote and received letters in the diplomatic language of the age. They fought Egypt, dealt with Western Anatolian powers, and tried to hold together a region where geography itself made control difficult. In the Aegean, Mycenaean palaces developed their own version of centralized life. At Pylos, Mycenae, Turin, Thebes, and other centers, rulers controlled fortified complexes and administrative territories. Their scribes used linear B, an early form of Greek written in a script adapted from earlier Aegean writing. The tablets they left behind were not meant to last forever. They were administrative tools, often preserved only because palace fires baked the clay hard enough to survive. In their accidental survival, these records offer a striking picture of a managed society. Women's work groups, bronze allocations, livestock, chariot equipment, land holdings, offerings, and officials. The Mycenaean palace was both practical and theatrical. Massive walls announced strength. Gateways and halls organized access. Storerooms and workshops made wealth visible and manageable. Fine pottery, weapons, seal stones, and imported goods connected local rulers with wider patterns of prestige. Yet the Mycenaean world was also divided. It was not a single Greek nation. It was a landscape of palace centers, each with its own territory, alliances, rivalries, and vulnerabilities. Later Greek memory would turn this age into the setting of heroic legend, but the tablets show something quieter and more bureaucratic, a world that counted before it sang. On Crete, older Minoan palace traditions had already shaped Aegean imagination. Knossos and other centers had shown how architecture, storage, ritual, art, and maritime contact could create a distinctive palace culture. By the late Bronze Age, the political relationship between Crete and the Mycenaean mainland had changed, and Mycenaean influence became visible. Still, Crete remained part of the wider sea-connected world. Its earlier palaces had helped define what an Aegean center of power could look like, not merely a fortress, but a place of ceremony, storage, craft, and controlled movement. The scribes who served these systems were not modern historians, but they preserved history by accident. Their records tell us what institutions cared about. They cared about quantities, names, categories, deliveries, shortages, and obligations. A tablet might list workers assigned to textile production or bronze distributed for tools and weapons. It might record offerings for deities or the equipment of a military force. These details can seem dry, but they reveal the nervous system of the palace. If a king was the head, the scribes were the nerves, carrying information through the body of the state. Administration also created distance between ruler and subject. A farmer's harvest could become an entry in a tablet. Flock could become a number. A woman weaving cloth in a palace work group might appear in a record not as a full life, but as labor counted by category. This was part of the power of the Bronze Age state. It could transform living activity into abstract obligation. But abstraction had limits. If fields failed, if workers fled, if soldiers deserted, or if roads became unsafe, the tablet could still demand what reality could no longer supply. Religion was woven into this political order. Palaces and temples were not always the same institution, but they were deeply connected. Rulers made offerings, built sanctuaries, supported priesthoods, and presented themselves as guardians of divine order. Festivals required food, drink, textiles, vessels, music, and movement. Sacred objects traveled. Statues could embody divine presence. A failure of kingship might be understood not only as political weakness, but as a disturbance in the relationship between people, gods, land, and order. War was another constant presence beneath the polished surfaces of palace life. Bronze Age armies used spears, bows, shields, swords, and chariots. The chariot in particular became a symbol of elite warfare across several regions. It required horses, specialized training, wheelwrights, leatherworkers, carpenters, metal fittings, and open terrain. Chariot forces were expensive and prestigious. They suited a world where rulers could gather resources and maintain specialists. Like bronze itself, the chariot was a military object that depended on a large support system. Diplomacy gave this world a language of equality and hierarchy. Great kings treated one another differently from lesser rulers. A king of Egypt might correspond with a king of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, or Hatti as a royal peer, while smaller Levantan rulers wrote in tones of dependence and urgency. Diplomatic marriages were arranged. Gifts were expected. Messengers carried words that could calm suspicion or sharpen insult. The palace world was formal but not peaceful. Even friendship had to be maintained through performance. The beauty of this system lay in its coordination. Grain could feed workers who built ships. Ships could carry copper. Copper and tin could become bronze. Bronze tools could harvest timber, shape stone, and arm soldiers. Soldiers could protect roads. Roads could carry tribute. Tribute could support palaces. Palaces could sponsor scribes. Scribes could count the grain that started the cycle again. The system was not perfect, and it was not gentle, but it was coherent. Yet coherence is not the same as resilience. The more centralized a palace became, the more its people depended on the center holding. If a palace burned, the archive burned with it. If the archive vanished, claims, obligations, and stored knowledge vanished too. If the ruler could no longer command obedience, redistributive systems could stop suddenly. The palace economy made complex life possible, but it also concentrated risk. A village might bend under pressure. A palace might shatter. By the end of the late Bronze Age, these palace societies were wealthy, literate, artistic, and militarized. They knew how to send letters across continents, move goods across seas, and organize thousands of people. They also lived close to the edge of what their systems could absorb. Their grandeur was real. Their vulnerability was real too. The same scribes who recorded abundance would soon record anxiety. The same ports that welcomed trade would watch for enemies. The same palaces that gathered wealth would become targets, ruins, or memories. The highways of copper, tin, grain, and gold. The Bronze Age world moved on water before it moved on roads. A ship crossing the eastern Mediterranean carried more than cargo. It carried trust, risk, language, and the assumption that somewhere beyond the horizon another harbor would still be waiting. In the hold might be copper ingots shaped like stretched hides, jars of oil or wine, bundles of textiles, ivory, glass, resin, timber, pottery, weapons, and gifts meant for rulers whose favor mattered. Every voyage was a thread in a wider fabric, and by the late Bronze Age that fabric stretched from Egypt and the Levant to Cyprus, Anatolia, the Aegean, and beyond. Bronze depended on this movement. Copper was widely useful, but copper alone was not enough for the characteristic tools and weapons that gave the age its name. Tin was the harder problem. It was rarer than copper in the eastern Mediterranean, and its sources were often far away. The search for tin created long chains of exchange, sometimes crossing regions that left few written records of their own. By the time tin reached a palace workshop, it might have passed through many communities, each adding distance, risk, and value. A bronze sword was therefore not simply a weapon. It was a finished expression of long-distance cooperation. Cyprus held a special place in this system because of copper. Its mines and ports helped make the island one of the central sources of raw material for late Bronze Age metallurgy. Copper could be cast into standardized ingots, transported by ship, and then remelted by craftsmen elsewhere. These ingots were practical objects, but they were also signs of a world that had learned how to move heavy industrial material across the sea. When a ship carried copper away from Cyprus, it was carrying the future tools, weapons, and ritual objects of distant societies. Trade was not always separate from diplomacy. Great kings exchanged gifts in ways that blended generosity, obligation, rivalry, and display. Gold from Egypt might travel as royal generosity, but it also declared Egypt's wealth. Fine objects could honor another ruler while reminding him of the giver's power. A diplomatic gift was never only a gift. It was a statement in material form. The recipient could measure respect by weight, craftsmanship, rarity, and timing. If the gift seemed too small, a king might complain. If messengers were delayed, suspicion could grow. The late Bronze Age has sometimes been described as having an international style among elites. Precious objects, artistic motifs, and luxury materials traveled far enough that palaces and tombs in different regions could share visual languages. Ivory carvings, glass, faience, gold vessels, decorated weapons, and painted pottery did not erase local identity, but they created a recognizable world of high-status exchange. A ruler could surround himself with objects that seemed to say, "I belong to the wider order of kings." The ordinary side of trade was less glamorous and more essential. Grain mattered more than gold when harvests failed. Timber mattered because many regions lacked the right wood for major building or ship construction. Horses mattered for chariots and elite warfare. Textiles mattered as clothing, wealth, tribute, and labor output. Olive oil, wine, and perfumed oils could be stored, transported, and redistributed. Pottery vessels carried commodities and also carried styles across the sea. A humble storage jar could travel farther than many people ever did. Ports were the hinges of this world. A harbor city connected sailors with scribes, dockworkers, merchants, guards, interpreters, and officials. Goods arriving by ship had to be received, weighed, recorded, taxed, stored, redirected, or presented. Inland roads and river routes extended the port's reach. A ruler who controlled a good port controlled not only a coastline, but access to distant materials. This made coastal cities wealthy, but also exposed. A port could be enriched by the sea and endangered by it. The sea itself was not an empty highway. It was seasonal, uncertain, and dangerous. Ancient sailors watched winds, currents, stars, coastlines, islands, and cloud forms. Ships could be blown off course, wrecked on rocks, captured by enemies, or delayed long enough to ruin plans made in palace offices. Cargoes could vanish beneath the water. Some shipwrecks, discovered thousands of years later, reveal how mixed and international these cargoes could be. They remind us that the Bronze Age network was not an abstraction. It existed in wood, rope, jars, anchors, ingots, and human judgment. Overland movement was slower but just as important. Donkeys, ox carts, riverboats, and human carriers connected inland cities to ports and fields. Mountain passes, desert edges, and river valleys shaped what could move and where. A kingdom might have military power, but geography still decided the cost of communication. Messages took time. Grain was heavy. Metal was valuable but difficult to protect. Armies needed supply. A distant vassal could be loyal on a tablet and unreliable in practice. Because the network was valuable, it required protection. Fortresses, patrols, alliances, and treaties helped keep routes open. But protection itself required resources. A palace needed soldiers to defend trade and trade to support soldiers. It needed copper and tin for weapons, but also weapons to secure copper and tin. The system curled back on itself. Each part justified the next. In prosperous times, that interdependence looked like strength. In crisis, it could become a trap. The palace economy also depended on predictability. If a shipment was late, a workshop might stop. If grain failed to arrive, laborers might go unfed. If diplomatic relations soured, access to foreign goods could shrink. If a port was destroyed, inland elites might lose their connection to the wider world. The more specialized the system became, the less easily each community could replace what it lost. A bronze workshop without tin was not merely inconvenienced. It was cut off from the material that defined its craft. There was also a psychological dimension to the network. Rulers expected the world to function through known channels: letters, tribute, treaties, marriages, gifts, shipments, and military obligations. When those channels failed, they were not just losing goods. They were losing confidence in the order that made kingship legible. A palace could survive a bad harvest if trade brought grain. It could survive a failed trade route if local stores were full. It could survive a rebellion if the army remained loyal. But if harvest, trade, loyalty, and security all weakened together, the palace had fewer answers. At the height of the Bronze Age, the highways of exchange made the world feel larger and smaller at once. Larger because goods and ideas traveled across astonishing distances. Smaller because royal courts could imagine themselves as members of the same diplomatic universe. A king in one land could complain to a king in another with the confidence that his words would be read, translated, understood, and answered. The world was stitched together by expectation, but every stitch can tear. A drought in one region could create hunger. Hunger could create migration, unrest, or pressure on neighbors. Raiding could make sea routes dangerous. Dangerous routes could interrupt metal supplies. Metal shortages could weaken armies. Weak armies could fail to defend palaces. Burned palaces could erase records. Without records, redistribution could fail. Collapse did not need one cause if the system was ready to transmit many causes at once. The Bronze Age trade network was therefore both an achievement and a warning. It showed that ancient societies could build connections far more sophisticated than older stereotypes allow. It also showed that complexity has a cost. The same ships that brought copper could bring danger. The same roads that carried tribute could carry refugees or armies. The same diplomatic ties that linked kings could become meaningless if the kings themselves lost control. The palace world had built highways across land and sea. Near the end, those highways would carry the signs of stress back to every center that depended on them. Storms at the edge of the palace world. The end of the Bronze Age did not arrive like a single night falling everywhere at once. It came unevenly, with warnings, local disasters, slow pressures, sudden fires, and memories later compressed into stories of destruction. Some cities were burned. Some were abandoned. Some shrank. Some survived but changed. Egypt endured though weakened. Assyria endured in its own way. The Hittite kingdom disappeared as a great imperial power. Mycenaean palaces fell and were not restored in their old form. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the old palace order lost its confidence, then its structure, then much of its memory. For a long time, people tried to explain this collapse by naming invaders. Ancient Egyptian inscriptions describe enemies from the sea, often grouped by modern scholars under the name Sea Peoples. These groups appear in Egyptian records near the end of the Bronze Age, especially in accounts of conflict under Ramesses III. The images and inscriptions show warriors, ships, families, carts, and movement. They are among the most vivid pieces of evidence from the crisis, but they are also difficult to interpret. They do not give us a simple answer. They show that people were moving and fighting. They do not prove that one invading people destroyed the entire Bronze Age world by themselves. The Sea Peoples may have included raiders, migrants, displaced communities, mercenaries, or groups pushed into motion by wider instability. Some names have been tentatively linked to later peoples or regions, but many identifications remain uncertain. The safest way to understand them is not as a single nation with one plan, but as part of a turbulent age of movement. They were symptoms of collapse as much as possible causes. A world under stress produces wanderers, armies, pirates, refugees, and desperate coalitions. The line between invader and displaced survivor can become very thin. Climate stress is another part of the story. Evidence from several regions suggests that drought conditions affected parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East around the time of the collapse. A long dry period could reduce harvests, weaken states, increase food prices, encourage migration, and strain diplomatic relationships. A palace economy could store grain, but storage was not magic. If bad harvests continued, reserves fell. If reserves fell, workers went hungry. If workers went hungry, loyalty weakened. If loyalty weakened, the palace had to spend more force maintaining what it once maintained through routine. Earthquakes may also have damaged cities in this broad period, especially in regions where seismic activity was common. But earthquakes alone cannot explain the whole collapse. A city can rebuild after an earthquake if its economy, leadership, workforce, and trade routes remain strong. The important question is not whether disasters happened, but whether societies still had the capacity to recover from them. Late Bronze Age palaces may have faced too many shocks too close together. A broken wall, a failed harvest, a lost shipment, and a hostile raid were each survivable in isolation. Together they could overwhelm repair. Internal rebellion and social unrest are harder to see archaeologically, but they must remain part of the picture. Palace systems place demands on farmers, workers, soldiers, and dependent communities. In good times, hierarchy can look stable. In bad times, obligations become burdens. People may flee, resist, raid, or stop cooperating. A palace that cannot feed its workers, reward its soldiers, or protect its dependents loses legitimacy. Collapse may have looked in some places, not like foreign conquest but like abandonment from below. Warfare was also changing. The expensive chariot-centered military systems of elite Bronze Age states may have been vulnerable to different forms of fighting. Infantry groups, raiders, and mobile attackers did not need to defeat a great kingdom in one formal battle if they could disrupt roads, burn storehouses, threaten ports, and make movement unsafe. Palace power depended on concentration. Disruption could be enough. A workshop cannot function if raw materials do not arrive. A garrison cannot hold if rations stop. A scribe cannot administer empty roads. The Hittite world shows the difficulty of separating causes. By the early 12th century before the Common Era, the Hittite Empire had vanished as a centralized great power. Its capital, Hattusa, was burned or abandoned in this general period, and the political landscape of Anatolia changed dramatically. But the end was not merely one enemy breaching one wall. The Hittite state had faced dynastic struggles, external threats, possible food shortages, and the problem of ruling a difficult region through layers of vassalage. When the center failed, the old imperial shape did not return. In the Mycenaean world, palace sites suffered destruction or severe disruption. Pylos, for example, preserves tablets that seem to belong to a moment of heightened concern, including attention to coastal defense. The palace burned, baking the tablets that allow us to read its final administrative traces. Other Mycenaean centers also show destruction or decline. What followed was not the immediate disappearance of all people, but the disappearance of the palace system as it had existed. Settlements continued in changed forms. Memory continued, but the bureaucratic, palace-centered world was gone. Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, offers one of the most haunting windows into the crisis. Its archives preserve letters from a world under pressure. Some messages speak of enemy ships, military need, and danger. The city was destroyed and not restored as the same kind of center. Because Ugarit stood at a major intersection of trade and diplomacy, its fall represents more than local tragedy. It marks the failure of one of the hubs that had helped connect the Bronze Age international world. Egypt survived the crisis, but survival was not the same as triumph. Egyptian inscriptions present victories over enemies, including groups from the sea, but the wider New Kingdom system weakened. Egypt's influence in the Levant diminished over time. A state can win battles and still lose the world that made those battles meaningful. The fact that Egypt endured reminds us that collapse was uneven. Some institutions broke completely, others contracted, adapted, or entered long decline. The collapse also changed the meaning of writing. In some regions, administrative scripts disappeared with the palaces that used them. Linear B vanished after the fall of Mycenaean palace administration. This does not mean that speech vanished or memory vanished, but a whole bureaucratic habit ended. When writing is tied closely to palace accounting, the destruction of the palace can silence the script. Later writing systems would arise in different forms, including alphabetic scripts that were easier to learn and more flexible in many settings. But there was a gap, a thinning of records, a darkening in the archive. It is tempting to imagine the Bronze Age collapse as a dramatic chain of burning cities, and there were indeed fires. Archaeology has found destruction layers at many places, yet the deeper story is systemic. A fire tells us that something burned. It does not always tell us who lit it, why defenses failed, whether people had already fled, or whether the city had been weakening for years. The ash layer is an ending visible in the ground. The causes were often older and wider than the flames. The best explanation is probably not a single cause, but a convergence. Drought, famine, migration, raiding, internal unrest, disrupted trade, political weakness, changing warfare, and natural disaster may have interacted. Each pressure made the others worse. A hungry population moves. Movement alarms neighbors. Alarm leads to militarization. Militarization consumes resources. Trade disruption creates shortages. Shortages weaken rulers. Weak rulers fail to protect roots. Unprotected roots invite more raiding. In such a loop, collapse becomes less like a hammer blow and more like a knot tightening. By around 1200 before the Common Era, the old palace world was breaking. Not everywhere in the same way, and not all at the same moment, but broadly enough that the Eastern Mediterranean entered a new age. The great correspondence of kings faded. Some cities were never rebuilt as they had been. Some arts and administrative habits disappeared. Populations moved. Political authority became smaller, more regional, and less dependent on the old international system. The storm had not destroyed all human life or all culture. It had destroyed a particular kind of world. After the fires, the world that rose from collapse. After the palaces burned, people still woke in the morning. They still needed water, bread, shelter, tools, stories, and protection. Collapse can make the past look like a clean break, but for those who lived through it, the world changed unevenly. Some families stayed near old ruins. Some moved to smaller settlements. Some joined new groups. Some became farmers under different rulers. Some carried memories of fallen cities into songs and local traditions. The Bronze Age palace system ended in many regions, but human life continued in altered forms. The first thing that changed was scale. The great palatial centers no longer organized production, storage, writing, and trade in the same way. In the Aegean, the fall of Mycenaean palaces led to smaller communities and fewer visible signs of centralized administration. Large-scale building declined. Long-distance elite exchange weakened. The linear B script disappeared. Pottery styles changed. Burial customs changed. The world became more local, less bureaucratic, and harder for historians to hear. This quieter period has often been called a dark age, especially in relation to Greece, but the phrase can mislead. It was dark mainly because written records became scarce, not because people stopped thinking, making, farming, sailing, or remembering. Communities adapted to a world without the old palaces. They made new arrangements for leadership and survival. They kept some traditions and abandoned others. They lived among traces of a larger past, walls too massive for the present, tombs from old dynasties, broken storerooms, and stories of kings whose names could become legend. In Anatolia and northern Syria, the disappearance of the Hittite Empire did not erase all Hittite traditions. Smaller Neo-Hittite and Aramaean states later emerged, preserving elements of language, art, royal symbolism, and political culture in new forms. The imperial center was gone, but fragments of its world lived on regionally. This pattern appears often after collapse. What vanishes at the top may survive at the edges. A great kingdom can die while its habits, titles, gods, and artistic forms continue under smaller powers. Along the Levantan coast, new opportunities opened as older imperial systems weakened. Phoenician cities would become famous in the early Iron Age for seafaring, trade, craft production, and alphabetic writing. Their rise was not simply a sudden invention out of nothing. It grew from older coastal traditions, maritime skill, and strategic position. But the changed political landscape gave such cities more room to act. When great empires pulled back or weakened, smaller maritime communities could become more influential. The spread of alphabetic writing marks one of the most important changes after the Bronze Age. Earlier writing systems could be complex and closely tied to scribal institutions. Alphabetic scripts used fewer signs and could travel more easily across languages and communities. The alphabet did not instantly create literacy for everyone, but it helped reshape communication. In the long run, it would influence Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, and many later writing traditions. One of the great ironies of collapse is that the fall of palace scripts helped make room for writing systems that eventually spread more widely. Iron also became more important after the Bronze Age, though the transition was gradual. Iron was not immediately superior in every way, and early ironworking required skill. But iron ore was more widely available than tin, and over time iron tools and weapons became more common. The old bronze system had depended on long-distance access to copper and especially tin. Iron did not eliminate trade, but it changed the material basis of power. A society less dependent on rare tin could develop different economic and military possibilities. The memory of the Bronze Age survived in transformed stories. In Greece, later epic tradition looked back to a heroic age of great kings, fortified cities, long wars, and famous warriors. The world of Homer is not a direct documentary record of the Mycenaean palaces, but it preserves echoes: bronze weapons, chariots, feasting halls, gift exchange, seaborne raiding, and memories of powerful citadels. Myth turned administrative societies into heroic landscapes. Scribes and ration lists faded. Warriors and singers remained. In the Near East, the early Iron Age saw new kingdoms, new peoples, and new political maps. Israel and Judah emerged in the highlands of the southern Levant. Aramaean states became important in Syria. Phoenician cities expanded their maritime reach. Assyria, after periods of contraction and pressure, would eventually rise again into a vast empire. Egypt continued, but with reduced power compared to its new kingdom height. The world after collapse was not simpler forever. Complexity returned, but it returned in different forms. One lesson of the Bronze Age collapse is that civilization is not a single ladder. It is a set of arrangements. The palace systems of the late Bronze Age were highly sophisticated, but their sophistication depended on specific institutions. Centralized storage, elite diplomacy, controlled trade routes, palace writing, chariot warfare, and specialized production. When those arrangements failed, people did not stop being human or intelligent. They reorganized around other possibilities. Collapse was not the end of history. It was the end of one structure of history. Another lesson is that interconnection brings both strength and risk. The Bronze Age world could move materials, ideas, and prestige across enormous distances. That made it wealthy and creative. But interconnection also meant that trouble could travel. A shortage in one region could affect workshops in another. A political crisis could disrupt trade far away. A maritime threat could unsettle inland economies. The first global world of the Eastern Mediterranean was not global in the modern sense, but it had enough connection to experience cascading failure. The ruins of the Bronze Age invite a special kind of silence. A burned palace does not explain itself. A broken tablet gives only part of a sentence. A shipwreck holds cargo but not the voices of the sailors. A fallen wall preserves force but not fear. Archaeology asks patient questions of these remains. It does not always get complete answers. That uncertainty is part of the truth. The Bronze Age collapse remains powerful because it resists simple explanation. It reminds us that history is often made from overlapping causes, partial evidence, and human decisions made under pressure. For a sleep-in class, the Bronze Age world offers more than catastrophe. It offers an image of people trying to make order from distance. They measured fields, counted sheep, sent letters, cast metal, crossed seas, built palaces, honored gods, trained horses, and stored grain against the future. They did not know they were living near the end of an age. Most people never do. They lived inside routines that felt permanent because they had been repeated for generations. Then the routines failed. Ships did not arrive. Letters went unanswered, grain stores emptied, enemies appeared at coasts and gates, palaces burned, scribes stopped writing. The great kings vanished from their old correspondence. Out of that silence came smaller settlements, new scripts, new metals, new kingdoms, and new stories. The world after the Bronze Age was not the same world, but it was not empty. It was a field after fire, altered and waiting. When we look back now, the Bronze Age collapse can feel distant, almost dreamlike. Yet its shape is familiar. A connected world becomes brilliant, specialized, and confident. Its leaders depend on systems they do not fully control. Its ordinary workers carry burdens that records barely acknowledge. Its trade routes seem reliable until they are not. Its centers appear strong until the edges begin to move. Then, slowly or suddenly, the structure reveals its hidden fragility. The Bronze Age ended, but it left behind more than ruins. It left behind the lesson that human achievement is often built through connection, and that connection must be cared for if it is to endure. It left behind stories of kings and sailors, scribes and smiths, farmers and refugees, gods and cities, fire and survival. It left behind the first great warning from the deep past, that a world can be magnificent, interconnected, and vulnerable all at once. And somewhere in that ancient dusk, after the last palace fires faded, people still carried embers into the next morning. They built smaller houses. They planted grain. They remembered names. They learned new metals. They shaped new letters. They told stories about the age before. Out of collapse, history continued, quieter at first, then gathering again into the long, uneven movement of civilization.